I almost canceled the date. It was a Tuesday evening, and I had just finished a long day at the office. The kind of day where the air in the conference room still smells faintly of coffee and dry erase markers. My jacket was draped over the back of my chair, and I was considering whether going home early might be the wiser choice. My sister had arranged the date. She'd been mentioning it for weeks. Quiet reminders at first, then gentle pressure. Finally a text that simply said, "Just meet her once. That's all I'm asking." So I agreed. I remember sitting at a small table in a neighborhood Italian restaurant. Nothing fancy, just warm yellow lights, the quiet sound of silverware, and the smell of garlic and fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. I expected a normal evening. Polite conversation, maybe an hour. Then we would both go our separate ways and my sister could finally say she tried. Then the woman walked in. She paused just inside the door, scanning the room the way people do when they're looking for someone they've never met before. When her eyes landed on me, she smiled and walked over with a calm confidence that immediately caught my attention. "Ethan?" she asked. "That's me," I said, standing to greet her. "You must be Claire." She nodded and sat down across from me. Right away I noticed something unusual. Most first dates have a kind of nervous energy. People glance at their phones. They fidget with the menu. They look around the room for a moment of escape. Claire didn't do any of that. She looked directly at me. Calm. Curious. Almost like she was trying to confirm something. We ordered drinks. Red wine for her. Bourbon for me. The conversation started easily enough. My sister had clearly told her a few things about me. She knew I worked in corporate law, that I had grown up nearby, that I was the responsible one in my family. She even smiled and said, "Your sister described you as the one who always has a plan." "That sounds about right," I said. She tilted her head slightly. "And do you like that?" she asked. It was an odd question. Most people ask what you do, not whether you actually like it. "I do," I said after a moment. "I like systems, rules, knowing how things fit together." "That makes sense," she said quietly. There was something thoughtful in the way she said it, as if the answer confirmed something she already suspected. The waiter came back and took our food order. Carbonara for her, bolognese for me. While we waited, we talked about ordinary things. Her job at a veterinary clinic. My sister's habit of interfering in people's lives. The strange reality of reaching your mid-30s and realizing life doesn't always follow the neat timeline people imagine in their 20s. Claire was easy to talk to. She asked questions that made conversations feel real instead of rehearsed. Not just what do you do, but why did you choose it? Not just where are you from, but what parts of it stayed with you. At some point I noticed something else. She kept studying my face. Not in a rude way, just quietly observant. Like someone looking at a photograph they were trying to remember. About 30 minutes into the dinner, she leaned forward slightly. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Do you fly very often for work?" The question caught me off guard. "Not much anymore," I said. "A few times a year maybe." She nodded slowly. "Do you like flying?" I took a sip of my drink before answering. "Not particularly," I said. "I was on a flight once that had some problems. Mechanical issues. We had to make an emergency landing." Claire's fingers tightened slightly around her wine glass. "When was that?" she asked. "About 8 years ago." She went quiet. For a few seconds, she just looked at me. Then she said something that made the entire restaurant seem suddenly very still. "You don't remember me, do you?" I felt my mind go blank. "Remember you from where?" She leaned forward across the table, her voice calm but softer now. "We met 8 years ago," she said. "On that flight." And for the first time that evening, I noticed something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Recognition. Then she added quietly, "You held my hand for 30 minutes while we thought the plane might crash. And suddenly I realized I might be sitting across from someone I had once searched an entire airport for and never found." I sat there for a moment, trying to pull the memory forward. Then I waited. For a moment, I didn't say anything. The restaurant was still full. Plates clinked. Someone laughed at a nearby table. A waiter walked past carrying a tray of drinks. But it all felt distant. My attention was fixed on Claire. "You're serious," I said quietly. She nodded. I leaned back slightly, trying to pull the memory into focus. 8 years is a long time. Most moments from that far back blur together. But that flight, that one had never fully faded. I remembered the turbulence first. It had started somewhere over the Midwest. The kind that makes the overhead bins rattle and causes that small shift in the cabin where people stop talking mid-sentence. At first, everyone assumed it would pass. Then the captain's voice came over the speakers. Calm, professional, but different from the usual updates. He said there was a mechanical issue. Nothing catastrophic, but serious enough that we would be making an emergency landing. I remember the silence that followed. You could feel the mood change in the cabin. People stopped pretending it was routine. A few passengers pulled out their phones, even though there was no signal at 30,000 feet. That's when I noticed the woman next to me. Window seat. She had been quiet during the entire flight, reading something on a tablet. But when the announcement came, she set the tablet down slowly and just stared out the window. Her hands were shaking. At first I didn't say anything. I figured she might want to be left alone. Then the turbulence got worse. The plane dipped suddenly, and the cabin filled with that low murmur of people trying not to panic. Flight attendants moved quickly down the aisle checking seatbelts. And the woman beside me started crying. Not loudly, just silent tears and shaking shoulders. Claire watched my face carefully as the memory came back piece by piece. You remember, she said softly. I remember someone, I said. The image was still incomplete. I remembered turning toward her, saying something simple. Something like, hey, we're going to be okay. The kind of sentence people say when they don't really know if it's true. I talked the entire time, I said slowly. Claire smiled. You did. I could see it more clearly now. Her hand gripping the armrest. Her breathing too fast. The way she kept looking toward the wings of the plane like she expected something terrible to happen at any second. You asked if you could hold my hand, I said. Her smile widened slightly. Actually, she said, you didn't ask. I didn't. She shook her head. You just reached over and took it. I let out a quiet breath. That sounded like something I might do in a moment like that. Not thinking, just reacting. I remember talking, I said. About everything, she replied. I tried to recall what I had said. Bits and pieces came back. I had talked about my family, my sister, growing up in Pennsylvania, random stories from college, work at the law firm, anything that might keep her focused on something other than the possibility that the plane might not land safely. Claire nodded as I spoke. You never stopped talking, she said, even when the turbulence got worse. I rubbed my thumb slowly along the edge of my glass. That's probably because I was just as nervous, I admitted. She laughed softly. I could tell. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she added something that surprised me. You kept your voice very steady. I looked up. I remember thinking, she continued, that if you sounded calm, then maybe things weren't as bad as they felt. The waiter arrived with our pasta, setting the plates down carefully between us. Neither of us touched the food right away. Claire rested her elbows lightly on the table. When the plane finally landed, she said, everyone stood up at once. People were grabbing bags, calling family members, crying. I nodded. That part one remember clearly. The landing had been rough, but safe. Emergency vehicles were already waiting when we reached the runway. Passengers had rushed off the plane as soon as the doors opened. I remembered standing in the aisle for a second, turning toward the window seat. You were gone, I said. Claire nodded. I ran. Why? She thought about that question for a moment. I was overwhelmed, she said honestly. Everything hit me all at once after we landed. The fear, the relief, all of it. She paused. And honestly, I didn't know what to say to you. I remembered searching the terminal for a few minutes, walking past crowds of passengers and airport staff. But the airport had been chaos. I tried to find you, I said. Her eyes widened slightly. You did. For a few minutes, I said. But I didn't know your name, or where you were going. Claire looked down at the table, almost thoughtful. I spent years wondering what happened to you, she said quietly. Years? She nodded. I think about that flight sometimes. About the guy who kept talking so I wouldn't panic. She looked back up at me. And I always wondered if you remembered me. I studied her face again. Now that the memory was returning, I could see the resemblance. Not exactly the same. 8 years changes people, but the eyes were unmistakable. You look different, I said. I hope so, she replied with a small laugh. I was 26 back then, and terrified. Very. For a moment, we both sat there with the strange realization settling in. Two people who had once shared 30 intense minutes on a plane, now sitting across from each other 8 years later because my sister thought we might get along. I shook my head slowly. This is one of the strangest coincidences I've ever experienced. Claire smiled. I thought so too, she said. Then she added something I hadn't expected. I recognized you the moment I walked into the restaurant. I blinked. You did. Immediately. And you didn't say anything? She shook her head. I wanted to see if you'd remember. I let out a quiet laugh. Apparently, that took me a little longer than expected. Claire picked up her fork finally. I didn't mind, she said. Then she looked at me again, the same calm curiosity returning. Actually, I wanted to know something first. What? She tilted her head slightly. I wanted to know if we'd still like each other when we weren't afraid we might die. I sat there for a moment, considering that. Then I smiled. That's a fair experiment. Claire nodded. And so far, she lifted her glass and took a small sip of wine. So far, she said, I think the results are promising. Outside the restaurant window, evening traffic moved slowly past. Inside, the two of us sat there quietly for a moment. Then I asked the question that had just occurred to me. So my sister, I said, does she know about any of this? Claire laughed. No idea. I leaned back in my chair, shaking my head again. Wait until she hears this story. Claire smiled. Something tells me she's going to love it. For a moment, the conversation paused. Then Claire said something softer. There's actually something else I remember about that flight. I looked up. What's that? She rested her hands around the stem of her wine glass. Your voice, she said. And then she hesitated slightly, as if deciding how much to say. I waited. Claire held her wine glass, but didn't drink from it. Your voice, she said again, quieter this time. I waited. It was steady, she continued. Not loud, not overly confident, just steady. She looked down at the table for a moment, almost thoughtful. I remember focusing on it. The rhythm of it. You kept talking about normal things. I tried to picture it again. The narrow airplane seats, the dim cabin lights, the smell of coffee and recycled air. I probably said whatever came to mind, I said. You did, she replied. Stories about your sister. Something about learning to drive in your father's old car. And a very long explanation about why contract language matters. I laughed quietly. That sounds exactly like something I would say under pressure. She smiled. You were trying to distract me. Honestly, I said. I was probably trying to distract both of us. Claire nodded. Maybe, but it worked. She paused for a second before adding something that shifted the tone of the conversation slightly. I heard that voice again a few years later. I looked up. What do you mean? She leaned back in her chair. At a conference. That surprised me. A veterinary conference? No, she said with a small smile. A legal one. Now I was confused. You went to a legal conference? I wasn't attending, she explained. The clinic I work at partners with a nonprofit that handles animal welfare cases. I went with one of the attorneys to help explain some of the medical aspects. I nodded slowly. That makes sense. She studied my face. You were speaking on a panel. My mind searched for the memory. Over the years, I had spoken at several conferences, corporate law seminars, continuing education panels, small legal forums. They blurred together. You were talking about regulatory language and contract risk, she said. Very lawyer topics. Sounds about right, I said. I was sitting in the back of the room, she continued. And halfway through the presentation, I realized something. What? I recognized your voice. That made me pause. You're saying you heard me speak and realized I was the guy from the plane? She nodded. It took me a minute, but yes. What did you do? Nothing, she said simply. I raised an eyebrow. Nothing. She shrugged lightly. You were surrounded by people after the panel. Everyone asking questions, handing you business cards. That sounds like a typical conference. I stood there for a minute, she said. Then I left. You didn't come say hello? No, why not? She gave a small, thoughtful smile. Because I wasn't sure if it was the right moment. I studied her face for a second. So you knew where I worked? Yes. And you still didn't reach out? Claire nodded calmly. That's right. There was no tension in her voice. Just a quiet certainty. It struck me that she had been carrying this knowledge for years. Meanwhile, I had never even realized. Did you ever think about contacting me? I asked. Once or twice, she admitted. But you didn't. No. She rested her hands flat on the table now, almost like someone placing papers in order before continuing a conversation. I realized something after that conference, she said. What? That moment on the plane mattered because of what it was. I waited. We were strangers, she continued. Two people who happened to be sitting next to each other at a very intense moment. That's true. And sometimes, she said, those moments are supposed to stay that way. I thought about that. A brief encounter. A moment of vulnerability. Then life continuing in different directions. But then my sister set up this date. I said. Claire smiled again. Yes. And suddenly the stranger from the plane was sitting across from me eating carbonara. That's about the size of it. I let out a quiet breath. That's remarkable timing. Claire tilted her head slightly. Or very patient timing. That made me laugh. I like the lawyer version better. Coincidence? Of course you do. For a moment the conversation slowed. The restaurant had become a little louder as the evening crowd filled in. Plates moving. Soft music somewhere near the kitchen. Claire finally picked up her fork and twirled a small bite of pasta. I should probably eat this before it gets cold, she said. That's a good idea, I agreed. We both started eating. But the mood of the evening had shifted, not in a dramatic way. Just a quiet awareness between us now. The sense that our lives had crossed once before and almost crossed again years later without either of us realizing. After a few minutes, Claire spoke again. Can I ask you something else? Sure. That day on the plane, when we finally landed. I nodded. You said you looked for me. I did. For how long? I thought about it. Maybe 10 minutes, I said. The terminal was crowded. Emergency crews everywhere. Claire nodded slowly. That sounds about right. Then she asked the question that changed the direction of the night. If you had found me, she said, what would you have done? I wiped my hands with the napkin and considered the answer. It was a simple question, but I wanted to be honest. I probably would have asked for your number. She looked up immediately. Really? Sure, I said. Why? I shrugged slightly. Because after holding someone's hand for half an hour thinking the plane might crash, it feels strange to just walk away and never see them again. Claire watched me carefully. And then what? I smiled a little. Then I would have taken you to dinner. She sat back in her chair slowly. Well, she said, that worked out eventually. We both laughed quietly. But the more I thought about it, the more something about the situation stood out. There had been 3 moments where our lives could have intersected again. At the airport, at the conference, and now, tonight. I set my fork down and said something without really thinking about it first. You know what's interesting? What? This might be the 3rd time the universe tried to arrange this dinner. Claire smiled softly. Maybe. Then she glanced toward the restaurant window where the evening had turned darker. And after a moment, she said something I hadn't expected. There's actually one more detail about that flight I never told anyone. I looked up. What kind of detail? She hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether to say it. Then she leaned forward slightly across the table. I wrote something down that day, she said. And for the first time that evening, my curiosity sharpened. What did you write? Claire held my gaze for a second. Then she said quietly, your name. I looked at her for a moment. My name, I said. Claire nodded. Just your first name? She explained. You mentioned it when you were telling me a story about your sister. I remembered that moment now. Somewhere between turbulence and the captain's updates, we had started exchanging small pieces of normal life. Names, where we lived, where we were headed. I didn't know your last name, she continued, but I wrote Ethan down anyway. Where? She reached into her purse calmly. The motion was unhurried, almost careful. From inside, she pulled out a small, worn notebook. The kind people carry for grocery lists or quick reminders. The edges were softened from use. She placed it gently on the table between us. This one, she said. I glanced down at it. You've had that for 8 years? Yes. I smiled slightly. That's impressive organization. She opened the notebook slowly and flipped through several pages. The paper had that faint texture older notebooks develop, a little soft, slightly yellowed near the corners. Finally, she stopped at one page. She turned the notebook toward me. In the center of the page, written in neat handwriting, were 2 words. Ethan, plain. Nothing else. Just those 2 small notes. I stared at it for a second. That's all you wrote. Claire nodded. At the time I thought it would be enough. Enough for what? To remember you. I let out a quiet breath. It was such a small thing. Just 2 words written in ink. But somehow it carried the weight of the moment they came from. You really kept this all these years, I said. Yes. Why? She thought about that question carefully. I think part of me believed that someday I might run into you again. I raised an eyebrow. That seems optimistic. Claire smiled. Or stubborn. I leaned back in my chair, studying the page again. It struck me that she had approached the whole situation differently than I had. I had searched briefly at the airport. Then life moved forward. She had kept a record. Not dramatic. Not obsessive. Just a small, quiet note in a notebook. A reminder. You know, I said after a moment, this is a very different strategy than mine. What do you mean? You kept documentation. She laughed softly. That's a very lawyer way to describe it. It's accurate, though. She closed the notebook and slid it back toward herself. I didn't know if it would ever matter, she said. But it felt wrong to let the memory disappear completely. For a moment, we both sat quietly again. Then I realized something else. So when you heard my voice at that conference, Claire nodded. You remembered the name. Yes. And that confirmed it was me. Exactly. I tapped the edge of the table thoughtfully. That means you had two separate confirmations before tonight. That's right. First, the voice. She held up one finger. And the name. She raised a second finger. And then tonight you walked into the restaurant and saw my face. She smiled. That was the third confirmation. I shook my head slowly. You realize this sounds like a very organized investigation. Claire raised an eyebrow. I work in veterinary medicine. Observing details is part of the job. Fair point. But it also meant something else. You had more information about me tonight than I had about you. That's true, she said calmly. And you still chose to sit down and see how the evening went. Yes. I studied her for a moment. And what? Did the experiment work? Claire's smile returned, slow and warm. Yes. She took another sip of her wine. Actually, she added, it worked better than I expected. I couldn't help smiling at that. The conversation shifted back into easier territory after that. We finished our dinner, talked about work again, about Philadelphia neighborhoods, about books we had both read, but the quiet knowledge remained there between us. This wasn't a typical first date. It was a continuation of something that had started years earlier in a narrow airplane seat. Eventually, the waiter brought the bill. I reached for it automatically. Claire didn't argue. We stepped outside a few minutes later. The air had cooled since we arrived. The street was calm, lit by rows of soft yellow streetlights. People passed occasionally on the sidewalk. For a moment, we stood there together. Can I walk you somewhere? I asked. I took a rideshare here, she said. You want me to call you another one? She shook her head. Actually, if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind a ride home. Of course. My car was parked a couple blocks away. We started walking. The city felt quiet in that late evening way. Distant traffic, the faint hum of a bus somewhere down the avenue. Halfway down the block, Claire spoke again. You know something interesting? She said. What's that? For 8 years, I thought the most important thing about that flight was the fear. I glanced over at her. And now? She looked up at the streetlights for a second before answering. Now I think it was the conversation. I nodded slowly. That's a better memory to keep. We reached my car. I unlocked the doors and we got inside. For a few minutes we drove in comfortable silence. Claire gave me the address to her building in Fishtown. It was about 15 minutes away. At a red light, she turned slightly toward me. Can I ask you something else? She said. Sure. If we had actually met again 8 years ago, right after that flight, I glanced over briefly. What about it? What do you think would have happened? It was an interesting question. I considered it carefully before answering. I think we probably would have had dinner, I said. Like tonight. Exactly like tonight. She nodded slowly. Then she said something thoughtful. In that case, what? We're not 8 years late. I raised an eyebrow. No. She smiled gently. We're just picking up where the conversation paused. The light turned green. I drove on quietly. And as we turned onto her street a few minutes later, I realized something. This didn't feel like the end of a date. It felt like the beginning of something that had been waiting a very long time. I pulled up near her building and put the car in park. Neither of us moved right away. Claire rested her hand on the door handle. Then she paused. Can I ask one last question? She said. Of course. She turned toward me again. That day on the plane, she said quietly. When you took my hand, I nodded. Was that planned? I shook my head immediately. No, Claire smiled softly. Good. Why? She looked at me for a moment. Then she said something simple. Because I'm starting to think the best things that happen in life aren't planned. The car went quiet again. Outside, the streetlights hummed softly above the empty sidewalk. Then I made a small decision, and I reached for the door handle. I stepped out of the car and walked around to the passenger side. Claire was already standing on the sidewalk by the time I reached her. The street was quiet. A few apartment windows were lit above us, and somewhere down the block a dog barked once and then went silent. She looked at me with a small, curious smile. You didn't have to get out, she said. I know, I replied, but I had already made the decision. Some moments deserve a little more attention. We started walking toward the entrance of her building. It was a narrow brick row house with a small set of steps leading up to the door. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of place people come home to after long days. At the top of the steps she paused. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she looked at me and said something that shifted the tone again. "I've been wondering something all evening." "What's that?" She folded her arms lightly, leaning back against the railing. "You're very calm about all of this." "All of what?" "The fact that we already met once before," she said. "That I recognized you immediately. That I've technically known who you were for several years." I considered that. "That's fair," I said. And I think it makes sense." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Explain." I leaned lightly against the railing across from her. "Well," I said calmly, "there are only a few possible explanations." She waited. I held up one finger. "First option, it's a coincidence." She nodded. "Second option," I continued, lifting another finger, "it's one of those strange life moments where two people cross paths more than once." "And the third option?" she asked. I gave a small smile. "The third option is that my sister is somehow secretly the most effective matchmaker on the East Coast." Claire laughed quietly. "That would be impressive." It would. For a moment we both stood there, comfortable in the quiet. Then she asked something more serious. "You're not bothered by the fact that I recognized you and didn't say anything at first?" I shook my head. "No, not even a little." "No, why not?" I answered honestly. "Because you handled it thoughtfully." She tilted her head slightly. "How so?" "You didn't turn it into a dramatic reveal," I said. "You waited to see if we could actually have a normal conversation first." She studied my face for a moment. "That was the plan. And it worked." Claire nodded slowly. "I think so too." There was a pause then. The kind of pause that isn't uncomfortable, just reflective. After a few seconds, she asked one more question. "When you realized who I was tonight, what was the first thing you thought?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked down the quiet street for a second before speaking. "The first thing I thought," I said, "was that it's a very strange world." She smiled. "That's a diplomatic answer. It's an honest one." "And the second thought?" she asked. I looked back at her. "The second thought," I said, "was that I was glad my sister convinced me to come tonight." Claire's expression softened. "I'm glad too." Another small silence settled between us. Then she said something a little quieter. "You know, there's one thing I never told you about that flight." I raised an eyebrow. "There are a lot of details from that flight. This one is different." "All right." She looked down briefly, as if deciding how to explain it. "When the plane started shaking," she said, "I was certain something bad was going to happen. That's understandable. I remember thinking that if the worst happened, I would at least not be alone." Her voice stayed calm, but the meaning of the sentence carried weight. "And then you started talking." I nodded slightly. "And suddenly it didn't feel like the end of the world anymore." She looked back up. "That's why I remembered you." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said something carefully. "You know something interesting about that?" "What?" "I don't remember feeling brave." Claire smiled. "That's usually how it works." "How what works?" "The people who help the most in those moments," she said, "rarely think they're doing anything special." I considered that quietly. Then I nodded. "That seems accurate." A light wind moved down the street for a moment, carrying the faint smell of rain from somewhere farther away in the city. Claire glanced toward the building door. "I should probably head inside," she said. "Of course." But she didn't move yet. Instead, she looked at me again. "Can I ask something slightly dangerous?" "Dangerous?" "Well, socially dangerous," she clarified with a small smile. "Go ahead." She hesitated just long enough to make the question feel genuine. "If we hadn't waited 8 years," she said, "do you think we would have liked each other back then?" I thought about it honestly. "Probably," I said. "Probably. I was a little more serious 8 years ago." Claire laughed softly. "You're still pretty serious." "That's fair." "And I was definitely more anxious back then," she admitted. "So maybe the timing is better now." She nodded slowly. "Maybe it is." Another quiet moment passed. Then she opened the building door halfway. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "You're welcome." "And thank you," she added. "For what?" "For finishing the conversation." I wasn't sure exactly what she meant at first. Then I realized. 8 years ago the conversation had ended when the plane landed. Tonight it had continued. And maybe something else had started. Claire stepped inside the building but paused just inside the doorway. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. Are you free tomorrow?" I smiled slightly. "I think I can rearrange a few things." "Good." She nodded once. Because I'd like to see where this conversation goes next. I watched her for a second. Me too. She gave a small wave and closed the door. I walked back to my car slowly. The street was quiet again. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. Then my phone buzzed. A text message. From my sister. It read, well, I looked at the screen for a second. Then I typed a short reply. You accidentally reunited me with someone I met 8 years ago on a plane. The typing dots appeared immediately. Then her response came through. You're joking. I set the phone down on the passenger seat. Then I waited. I didn't start the car right away. My sister's message was still on the screen. You're joking. I stared at it for a moment, then typed a longer reply. Emergency landing flight. 8 years ago. She was sitting next to me. A few seconds passed. Then my phone rang. I answered. You can't just send a message like that, my sister said immediately. What do you mean you met her 8 years ago? I leaned back in the driver's seat. Exactly what it sounds like. There was a pause on the other end. You're serious? Yes. Okay, she said slowly. Start from the beginning. So I did. I told her about the flight, the turbulence, the emergency landing, the woman in the window seat who had been terrified. The 30 minutes of conversation meant to keep both of us calm. Then I told her about tonight, about Claire recognizing me when she walked into the restaurant, about the notebook, about the conference years earlier where she had heard my voice and realized who I was. My sister was quiet for several seconds after I finished. Then she said something very calmly. That might be the best accidental thing I've ever done. You didn't do it on purpose. I know, she said. That's what makes it better. I could hear her smiling through the phone. So, how did the date actually go? It went well. That's all you're giving me. I'm a lawyer, I said. We tend to keep summaries brief. She laughed. Let me translate that, she said. You liked her. Yes. And she liked you. Yes. And now you're trying not to overthink it. That part made me pause. That obvious? I've known you your entire life, she said. Of course it's obvious. I glanced up at Claire's building across the street. You know what's strange? I said. What? It doesn't feel complicated. That's good. It just feels clear. My sister went quiet again. Then she said something thoughtful. You've spent a lot of years making sure everything in your life is predictable. That's not entirely true. Mostly predictable, she corrected. Fair enough. And now something unpredictable happened. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. That's accurate. So maybe, she said, you should just let it be simple. I considered that. For once, I didn't have a counterargument. I'll try, I said. Good. There was another small pause. So, she added, are you seeing her again? Yes. When? Tomorrow. Wow, she said. That was fast. We've technically had 8 years to prepare. She laughed again. I like this version of you, she said. What version? The one that sounds excited about something. I looked at the quiet street again. I think I am. Good, she said. Now go home and get some sleep. I will. And Ethan? Yeah. Don't overthink this one. I'll do my best. We hung up. I started the car and drove home through the quiet evening streets. The city was calmer at that hour. Fewer cars. Long stretches of empty intersections. The kind of peaceful rhythm cities get late at night. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt oddly settled. Not excited in the loud, dramatic way people sometimes describe. Just calm. Certain. Inside, I set my keys on the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of water. Then I sat down at the small table near the window. My phone buzzed again. A new message. From an unknown number. I opened it. Hi, Ethan. It's Claire. I smiled slightly. Another message appeared right after it. Kennedy gave me your number. I hope that's okay. I typed back. That's perfectly okay. A few seconds later she replied. I'm glad tonight happened. I read the message twice before answering. Me too. 3 dots appeared as she typed. Then her next message came through. Same time tomorrow? I thought about it for about 1 second. Yes. Her response came quickly. Good. I already have an idea for what we should do. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the screen for a moment. Then I typed. Now I'm curious. A few seconds later she sent the final message of the night. Bring an open mind. I set the phone face down on the table. Then I waited for a moment, letting the quiet settle around the room. 8 years earlier, a conversation had started in the middle of a crisis. Tonight it had continued over dinner. And tomorrow it would continue again. For once, I wasn't trying to map out where it would lead. I simply went to bed knowing the next day would bring another chapter of the same story. And that felt like enough. Then I slept. The next morning started quietly. Sunlight came through the kitchen window while I made coffee. The same routine I had followed for years. Kettle, mug, a few minutes of silence before the day began. But something felt different. Not dramatic, just lighter. I sat at the table and checked my phone. There was a message from Claire sent earlier that morning. 7 p.m. tonight. Casual clothes. Trust me, that was the entire instruction. No explanation. I smiled. For someone who had spent most of his adult life organizing contracts and predicting outcomes, it felt unusual to accept an unknown plan so easily. But I did. That evening we met again. The second date wasn't a fancy restaurant or a carefully arranged setting. Claire had taken me to a small pottery studio tucked between two storefronts in South Philadelphia. Rows of pottery wheels, clay on every surface, a patient instructor explaining how to center the clay properly. Within 20 minutes I had managed to collapse 3 bowls. Claire's first attempt looked like a vase that had survived a small accident. We laughed more than either of us expected. Afterward, we walked through the neighborhood with clay still under our fingernails and grabbed tacos from a small place on the corner. Nothing dramatic, just conversation. Real conversation. About work. About the years between the flight and now. About the strange way life sometimes pauses and then quietly reconnects people when they least expect it. Later that night, after I dropped her off again, she stood in the doorway of her building and said something simple. I'm glad the conversation continued. That was the phrase she kept using. The conversation. Not fate. Not destiny. Just the conversation that had started 8 years earlier and somehow found its way forward again. When I drove home that night, I realized something my sister had said was true. Sometimes the most important changes in life don't arrive with a big announcement. They show up quietly. A seat on a plane, a name written in a small notebook, a blind date you almost canceled, and suddenly 2 people are continuing a conversation they never expected to finish. A few weeks later, my sister told the story to a friend of hers. That friend mentioned someone else who had lost touch with a person from a long time ago and wondered if reconnecting might still be possible. It made me think about something. There are probably more unfinished conversations in the world than we realize. Some of them just need a little time before they continue. That night, before going to sleep, I placed my phone on the nightstand and looked at the quiet room around me. Everything felt steady, ordered, peaceful. The same apartment, the same routine, just with the possibility of something new growing slowly inside it. And that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you might think. And I'm always curious about the people listening. Leave a comment and tell me which city you're watching from and what time it is there right now. 2 more stories will appear on your screen next, and one of them might be another quiet story about a moment that changed someone's life in a way they never expected. Until then, thanks for listening.